Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
From war hero to peace promoter, the true story of Siegfried Sassoon is a new biography by Duncan Marlor of all the war poets. Sassoon is my favourite, so it's my very great pleasure to welcome Duncan to the show. Duncan, good morning to you.
Good morning to you too. I'm pleased to speak to you.
Yeah, very pleased.
Thank you very much for your interest in my book.
Well, no, Sassoon has always been to me a fascinating character. I mean, I suppose it's one of the things, along with Owen and Isaac Rosenberg of the great war poets, that. And obviously, to a certain extent, Brooke, though obviously he doesn't see the horrors of trench warfare. You know, Sassoon is there. Yeah, sorry.
Well, Brooke, one always thinks if he hadn't died in the very early stages of the war, might he have become a Siegfried Sassoon or a Wilfred Owen? Because we don't know.
Indeed, because you know he doesn't get to see the, as I said before, the horrors of trench warfare.
No,
Sassoon, but Sassoon, like so many young men of that generation, went into war, perhaps with the Brookian version that it was going to be a great adventure. Explain a little bit, perhaps, who Sassoon is before the war, how he leads into the war.
Yes. Well, I've focused on Sassoon from about the end of 1915. I did look at Sassoon before the war, but my book focuses on Sassoon's political protest against the war, which I think has been really extraordinarily overlooked, or at least only looked at in passing. I think he's not. I think that Sassoon has not been given his due deserts as a political thinker. I think he was more than a poet. He did, in the course of 1916 and 1917, he got to know politicians in Britain when he was on leave, when he'd been wounded and invalided home. In particular, there was Lady Ottoline Morrell, who adored his poetry, but her husband was Philip Morrell. Now, Philip Morrell was one of a group of MPs in the House of Commons who've been almost completely omitted by history, which I think is fairly extraordinary, who were in favour of ending the war by negotiation. Sassoon got to know Philip Morrell quite well, and he read up himself on all these things like the suspected secret treaties of sort of carve-ups of territory and whatnot, keep the war going, get Italy in, promise Italy territory and so on. And the Sykes-Picot agreement of 1916, that Britain and France were going to sort of carve up the Middle East between them. All this was suspected, and the group in the House of Commons, including Philip Morrell, they raised this issue, but they were a small minority, and they have been rather omitted by history. I think they've sort of slipped through the net of history. But then Sassoon made his statement in 1917 in alliance with this group, and also with Bertrand Russell, who was acting as Sassoon's impresario. And one of the MPs, Bertie Lee Smith, found an opportunity, found a debate in 1917 to read out Sassoon's statement, and it started, I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I believe that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. And it went on at a little length, and Bertie Lee Smith read it out, and this was under parliamentary privilege, so it meant that it could be published in the in the newspapers, and it was in the Times the next day. It caused rather a sensation because the case for peace and the case against the war was something that people didn't usually get to hear. There was the Defence of the Realm Act, the Official Secrets Act, there was censorship, and there was the mass of official propaganda, that the continuation of the war to the bitter end, rejection of the peace feelers that were coming from Germany, which had caused the overthrow of Asquith, because it was thought that Asquith, as Prime Minister, might be likely to respond to the German peace feelers. So he'd been replaced by Lloyd George, who was a bitter-end hardliner on the war. And it caused a bit of a sensation, but the interesting thing, I believe, the distortion of Sassoon is that I think his biographers have not quite picked up exactly what his plan was with the parliamentary peace group. That he'd made this statement, he was almost certain to be court-martialed, and goodness knows what was going to happen to him, but it was meant to coordinate with a bit of a rumpus in the House of Commons, and Lee Smith did find his moment, but the person who stopped Siegfried Sassoon in his tracks was his fellow war poet Robert Graves, and this is what I think really has been the point has been missed, that Sassoon was absolutely determined. He was going to go on with his protest, the court-martial and all the rest of it, but Robert Graves told him something that was an absolute lie, that he had it on good authority, and he swore on an imaginary Bible that on good authority that the military authorities were not going to court-martial him. Instead, they were going to put him in a common lunatic asylum. So he'd get no publicity. He would just disappear. And at that point, Sassoon's protest was no good anymore, and so he stood down his campaign. So by the time that Bertie Lee Smith read out the statement a few days later in Parliament, Sassoon was already on his way to the military sanatorium, having agreed to accept the authority of the medical board that when he had written this statement, he was sort of deranged by shell shock, so he wasn't really his proper self.
It's an interesting one, isn't it, Malcolm?
Really how it ended, which I think was rather. But I think the interesting question is, but for Graves and his very very determined and cleverly worked out lie, but for that, what might have happened if the full blaze of publicity had gone ahead? But we just don't know.
The interesting thing, Malcolm, is that most people who've got a passing thing of Sassoon, obviously the sanatorium, when he's in the sanatorium and he meets Owen, and there's always that two great poets in that idyllic setting. But we don't tend to know. We just think he turns up there with sort of shell shock, don't we? I mean, I was unaware of this whole political, and if you think about it. If you think about the way that, war is reported, because until then, war has been the great adventure. It's a continuation, if you like, of the games of the playing fields of Eton. And it's gallant. Even though it's not gallant, it's bloody and it's nasty and it's horrendous. Crimea, etc., Franco-Prussian War. But the way that war was reported as this wonderful game, and thousands of young men are slain. It is. They call it shell shock, now we call it PST, but the effect that this has on the psyche. But also, if Sassoon had been able to convince people not to push for a total and humiliating victory over Germany, that has a knock-on effect, because, as I always say, three imperial powers go into this war. Russia, Germany with the Kaiser, the Romanovs obviously in Russia, and the former Saxe-Coburgs in the Great Britain. But only one of them comes out. And it sows the seeds, the humiliation of the German defeat or the German agreement sows the seeds for the Second World War as well.
Well, the parliamentary peace group that with whom Sassoon liaised, they said time and time again that if if this war is ended not by mutual negotiation but by Germany being crushed, there will certainly be another war within a generation, and they were absolutely right. One of the people, so ironically, one of the people in Parliament, he wasn't in the peace group as such, but he was a sort of ally of them, David Mason, a Scotsman who sat for the seat of Coventry, and he made this case very strongly. And then, of course, he was absolutely right, because in 1940, the Coventry's medieval cathedral was flattened by German bombers in the war that he, Mason, the MP for Coventry, had predicted. Because I think that I think it's really fairly eye-watering what if I know the odds were colossally against peace in 1917, but I think not impossibly. And I think if the Sassoon campaign had sort of got things moving in the direction of peacemaking, you think about Russia. The Romanovs had gone then; they'd been overthrown in the first revolution of the spring of 1917. And I was very interested that thinking about everything to play for in the summer of 1917, I was quite interested that Martin Sixsmith, in his history of Russia, talking about Russia as it was before the Second Revolution, before Lenin and and his communist revolution, in the summer of 1915, when that sort of transitional government, as it turned out, in Russia, was taking shape, with its sort of mixture of liberals and socialists, then there was everything to play for, because a lot of people wanted to make peace. And as I say, Sixsmith, in his history of Russia, said that it was impeccable liberalism. They did away with the death penalty, censorship of political expression, and so on. It was a liberal dream in a way. I know there were the groups and factions. There were Lenin and the Trotskyists and others and so on. We didn't know what was going to happen eventually, but a lot of people did want to make peace in Russia. Had Russia made peace, then perhaps there would never have been a Stalin regime. Just as in Germany, had peace been made, then there would have been no Nazis. And we think of all the consequences coming down to this century.
But
I noted in Sassoon's diary, when he went back to the front in 1918, he was at Gaza at one point. So again, you think about the wars of now going on, and you wonder about what might have happened if the world had gone another way. Of course, we don't know what other nasty things might have.
Yeah, it's the counterpoint, isn't it? But the thing is, I mean, the Kaiser Wilhelm, of course, sends Lenin back to Moscow because he thinks it's going to sort of cause confusion, and it does, but not in the way that sort of it all pans out. I'm just interested as well because it's a different generation. Obviously, I mean, we're talking a period over 100 years ago now, but when troops come home or even, get invalided out, they don't, because they have seen horrors of which we have not seen in the world before, they can't, a lot of them, especially the ordinary fighting men, can't find words to describe what they have seen. Obviously.
No, that's absolutely right. I was struck by looking at other poets, David Jones's book, memoir in parentheses, using this phrase in parentheses because soldiers kept it to themselves. And Sassoon makes this point as well, that it was like a sort of conspiracy of silence. And there was a reviewer of a book of Sassoon's poems, Counterattack, that came out in the summer of 1918, Max Plowman, and he makes the point that Sassoon's poems are breaking the conspiracy of silence.
Yeah.
Through Sassoon's poems, you hear the trenches as they really are, the war as it really is.
What strikes me about Sassoon's poetry as opposed to Owen's poetry is the fact that Owen's is melancholic, whereas Sassoon's there is an anger in it. So when you read Aftermath, which I always do on Remembrance Sunday, there is an anger in that, whereas Sassoon is almost foretelling his own death with the melancholy, with you know what passing bells for those who dies cattle. Whereas Sassoon's is visceral and guttural.
I think that's an excellent point. I think you put your finger on it absolutely, that there is that difference between Sassoon and Owen with his melancholy. Sassoon was quite an angry politician by 1917. He really wanted peacemaking to get going, to stop the horrors, and he was trying to convey in his poetry what it was really like. I was rather struck by looking at Sassoon's notebooks, his notebooks in the archive at Cambridge from 1917, when he'd just come out of the battle. This was when he'd just been returned to Britain, and he was sort of in hospital recovering, and he was sort of thinking about the experience of being in the battle, and it was sort of disjointed. Though he was just it was like stream of consciousness, just putting down phrases as they came to him, and he puts. The last few weeks in the war zone, the attack, getting away with it. Now that you think about the lottery of life and death in the bullets, so you can imagine you don't really need it spelled out. But then he says vivid incidents, and again you don't really need to be told what you can imagine vivid incidents. But then he says taking souvenirs from dead Germans. Well, of course, you don't hear about that in but it no doubt happened on both sides. That in the unpleasantness of war, because each side, of course, sanitizes it for the consumption of their own public and so on. But if you would imagine that it would happen, and
and it's that whole thing about having a blighty wound to take you home. Thank God they had to amputate. I mean, that is far away from sort of the noble Tommy sort of fighting the hard as you can get.
Absolutely, yes. I was struck by the pervasiveness of the word. Of that phrase, blighty wound. It seemed in the army, to judge from Sassoon's diaries and correspondence, it seemed to be everywhere. In the sort of moments of waiting to go up over the top, the sort of nervous gallows humor. But you've got this phrase, "Who's for a blighty wound?" Then, because the blighty wound would just get you out of the combat zone. Hopefully, not enough to permanently disable you or damage you. But then I thought that Sassoon's parody satire on that is rather good. When the one-legged man, the title, where he writes, "Splendid to eat and sleep and choose a wife, safe with his wound, a citizen of life. He hobbles blithely through the garden gate. Thought, thank God they had to amputate." You get with Sassoon, that comes back to your point of the difference between Sassoon and Owen, there's the sort of sharpness, the sort of sucker punch at the end. You're lulled into thinking, oh, this is an anecdote, sort of laid back, anecdotal, and then he sometimes with a sort of pause of one line, and then he sort of hits you with the punchline at the end.
So where's the primary? Where are you getting your sources from on this one, then, Duncan? Because it'd be very because obviously people could assume you could accuse you making assumptions about Sassoon, and so diaries, journals.
Yeah, well, the main source is his diaries in his notebooks at Cambridge University Library archive, but the diaries, quite a lot of his diaries have been published a while ago. But now I did find one mistake in the transcription of the diaries when a fellow soldier that he was very fond of had been killed, and they were burying him, and he was saying he wrote in his notebook only a few days ago he was here reading his notebook. Now, actually, it was not his notebook, but this notebook. So the very notebook where his comrade his comrade had been reading, the very notebook, he found himself recording the man's death. There are, because there are numerous published editions of his poems. Some of them published during the war. Some of them in his lifetime. Some of them not until after his death. But I did have one little scoop in the book, and that was a new discovery. I think it was 2013. It turned up at an auction sale at Bonhams in London. This was Siegfried Sassoon's poem called Atrocities. Now, he wrote that in 1917. It was published after the war, and this was on the subject, the pretty gruesome subject of the killing of German prisoners. Of course, it went on both sides in the war.
Sure.
Mentioned that the throwing of sort of shoving the prisoners into dugouts and into shell holes and then chucking bombs at them and so on. It did, because the war being a war of attrition, to see each side trying to kill with the lines being deadlocked, each side trying to kill more than the other side to wear them down. Yeah. So it's hardly surprising that this sort of horror happened, but on both sides, of course. But the thing with this what came up at this auction sale in 2013 was the original Sassoon's original version of the poem, plus a letter that he wrote about it to the editor of the Cambridge magazine, which published some of his stuff. Now, I got in touch with the auctioneers to see whether of course, I'm not allowed to know the purchaser, but unless the purchaser wanted to know me. So I got in touch, and happily, it was a lady who was very happy to share the discovery with me. She digitized it and sent it over, and said she was happy for me to use it in my book. But the interesting thing about this original version was that he uses the word murder.
Duncan, I'm afraid I've only got 30 seconds left before we go to the news, so I'm going to have to leave it there. The book is called From War Hero to Peace Promoter. You can order it via the link in our own virtual bookstore. Do you have a website, Duncan, or are you off the internet?
Well, I haven't yet. I haven't got. I haven't got a website set up yet, but
Right.
I may set one up.
Well, you can order the book via our own virtual bookstore. The book is called From War Heroes to Peace Promoter. Duncan Marlor, thank you so much for your time today.